the Medical AI Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Medical AI Podcast, a 30-minute thrill ride of big ideas. I'm Dr. Felix Beecher and I discuss with scientists, innovators and philosophers. Clinical trials are the cornerstone of the development of new treatments. One can see them as a shining example of the scientific method in practice. One can also see them as phenomenally expensive, with a high rejection rate and a record of passing treatments that are ineffective. So, how is AI being used to address these kinds of problems? With me to discuss this is Harsha Rajasimha, CEO of Jeeva Clinical Trials. Harsha, a very warm welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Felix, for having me today.
It's great to have you on. So, could you please introduce yourself, Harsha?
Absolutely. I'm Harsha Rajasimha. I'm the founder and CEO of Jeeva Clinical Trials, a company headquartered here in Virginia. I'm also the founder of Indo-US Organization for Rare Diseases, a nonprofit organization on a mission to accelerate clinical research for rare diseases and catalyzing cross-border collaborations between US and India. More broadly, I'm a rare dad and a brother of a young man who suffered from juvenile diabetes and trained as bioinformatics genomics data scientist, experience spanning NIH, FDA as a consulting scientist, and also consultant to Big Pharma, having been part of multiple startups. I've been on this mission to accelerate clinical research with technology innovation for the last 6 years now.
Okay, great. So we're going to be talking about big issues with clinical trials as it relates to AI systems. But could you first just tell us what clinical trials are and why are they important?
Absolutely. In the context of interventional clinical trials, process of developing new therapy or diagnostic through the phase one, phase two, phase three process, which is a regulatory requirement for testing the safety and efficacy of a drug or device, and demonstrating that in a smaller trial for safety in phase one, efficacy in phase two, and a much more broader safety and efficacy evidence on a larger scale in phase three, collectively, which becomes part of a regulatory submission that seeks to market the product based on the positive evidence that may be generated during the clinical trials, which does not happen always. Many times, in fact, 8 or 9 out of 10 times, clinical trials do fail, or drug candidates do fail in the valley of death, as they call it. And so it's highly risk prone, both from the nature of the chemistry and the aspect of the drug candidate itself, but also due to delays and operational challenges that clinical trials as a complex process have to go through.
Okay, so when people think of clinical trials, probably what they're thinking of is these large phase three trials where drug is tested in a group of patients, and that the results of that test is compared to same sort of patients with placebo, right? So it's
That's
a
it.
way of testing the effectiveness and safety of the drugs. Okay, good. So now, when you talk about the risk of clinical trials, what kind of risk do we mean? What kind of impact does a failed phase three trial have on a company?
It's really huge, right? So late phase clinical trial failures should not occur ideally, but as we have seen industry wide, on an average, after phase one third of candidates fail, and only two-thirds progress to phase two.
Yeah.
And again, after phase two, one-thirds fail, and only two-thirds progress to phase three. And at phase three, also there is a good percentage of late stage failure still happening in the industry, which
Yeah.
can cause significant damage to both patients who might be waiting for drugs to come through the regulatory process, but also to the companies that are sponsoring these trials, which can cost $100 million at phase 3 level, to lose a lot of time, money, and effort that goes into this complex process.
Now, we were going to be talking about the big issues with AI in clinical trials, but first of all, why don't we get a little bit of context? Could you explain your personal involvement in clinical trials and how Jeeva, what the kind of involvement that Jeeva has?
Absolutely. So Jeeva is a B2B software as a services company headquartered here in Manassas in Prince William County in Virginia. We are on a mission to modernize the way clinical trials are conducted in a unified software platform in an automated fashion, what we call human-centric software and turnkey CRO solutions. We are on a mission because it's personal to me as a founder who had a child with a rare disease in 2012 and a younger brother with a lifestyle disease like diabetes that I lost in his young age of 30s due to complications resulting from that, as he did not have access to continuous glucose monitoring devices back then while he was studying in India. And so that's what we do at Jiva.
And do you specialize in particular disease areas?
Absolutely. As a rare dad, I naturally had the startup focus on rare and genetic diseases as we got started and validated it in various academic medical centers and hospitals, including at the Children's National Hospital here in Washington, D.C. But as we evolved, we got a lot of interest from cancer clinical trial space, and so we have been honored to support the approval of a CAR T cell gene therapy for leukemia and B cell lymphoma. And cancer has become a natural area of focus, as well as multiple others. Much of the solutions we develop are disease area agnostic, as we address the operational and logistical challenges and not so much the clinical challenges.
Okay, so we've already touched on some of the problems with clinical trials, namely the sometimes fantastically high cost of them, but also the rejection rate and all sorts of issues. But could you explain a little bit more about diversity and how that affects clinical trials?
Absolutely. One of the striking inequities in clinical trials and access is that 90% of these clinical trials are historically conducted in 10% of the population, mostly US and European population, while the rest of the world has not been engaged or very minimally engaged. And that's one huge issue which the FDA recognized and has issued guidances in the last few years, especially coming out of the pandemic, when particularly the problem was strikingly visible and obvious. And so there is now requirement by regulators like FDA to have a racial and ethnic diversity plan, or REDP, which requires sponsors to submit. Not that every trial needs to have all the race and ethnicity represented, but it just needs to be proportional to the prevalence and epidemiology of the specific disease that the clinical trial is targeting. And based on that, the diversity plan needs to be consistent with the epidemiology of that indication.
So, can you give us a good example of where a disease disproportionately affects certain racial groups and how the clinical trial sample should reflect that?
Great question, Felix. An obvious thing that comes to mind is uh, sickle cell disease or other similar blood related disorders like hemophilia, thalassemia, and so on, where they are predominantly affecting the sub Saharan African population or Middle East and Asia, including India, whereas there is sickle cell disease is still considered a orphan disease and receives orphan designation for these drugs in the US. About less than half a million people are estimated to be living with sickle cell in US, whereas 5 million people in Africa and 1 million estimated in India and other countries. And so that's one example. where it
Yeah. Now, sickle cell anemia is relatively rare disease. If we think about the really big killers in globally, we're talking about things like cancer and heart disease and diabetes and so forth. Now, do you think that this question about racial proportionality is relevant to those as well, or less relevant, or what?
it is definitely relevant in all diseases, as the food, lifestyle, genetic background, and habits all vary from a race and ethnicity point of view. But when we talk about gender, diversity, and inclusion, we also talk about gender, age, as a lot of these drugs and vaccines are first developed for adult population, for example, and then later on for elderly population, and lastly for pediatric population. So the access to therapies are not equitable, not just from a race and ethnicity point of view, but also gender. For example, the cholesterol and cardiovascular drugs have done very good for men with statins and cholesterol lowering drugs, but we know that through scientific evidence, it does not work as effectively on women, for example, in the case of cardiovascular and
Yeah.
disease drugs. And so there is race, gender, age, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, income levels. While high income families have been historically more engaged and recruited in clinical trials, low income families have less access to these therapies, either because they are not offered to enroll in with the assumption or presumption that they may not actually complete the clinical trial itself, or because they don't access healthcare as much.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's talk about AI systems then and how those can help address some of the issues present with clinical trials. Why don't we start with this issue about the racial diversity in clinical trial samples? How are those two things connected?
Absolutely. I think it's a great question. AI by definition is technology that relies on historical data to predict the future, or look at the inefficiencies in the historical clinical trials to make future clinical trials more diverse, more efficient, and so on. Now, the problem is historical data sets are biased already, and because 90% of these trials have been conducted in a very small proportion of the global population. And so relying on that data to guide the future would not be a good way to proceed. And hence, there is a fundamental limitation in addressing certain types of problems and questions. But obviously, there are several other scenarios and use cases where AI can and has been making an impact. For example, in the drug discovery space, AI has been doing phenomenally well in helping identify drug targets or drug candidates at a unprecedented pace in the recent years in terms of high throughput screening and discovery. And these candidate drugs that are predicted through AI now need to be tested in actual clinical trials involving
Mhm.
human subjects. And the process of conducting clinical trials has not caught up to the same level of efficiency of the drug discovery and process, where AI has made a significant dent already. But there are numerous aspects of clinical trials where AI can and is already playing a big role. For example, in terms of protocol design and writing, generative AI has the ability to create draft protocols based on certain minimal input by the clinical experts and investigators that can then be quickly converted into a fully developed protocol much faster than if it were to be designed manually from scratch. Uh,
There's something slightly comic about about this. As somebody who has in the past designed clinical trials and written clinical trial protocols, the idea of getting ChatGPT to just knock one out is, I don't know, it's very funny and it's delightful, and I don't quite know what to make of it. Could you just tell us a bit more about how that might work?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a iterative process, and we need to approach it with a lot of caution, and with the understanding that it's a iterative process where a human expert is not expected to be eliminated, but supported and supplemented with some generative AI capabilities, not necessarily from the general large language models, but more on a domain specific trained domain specific models, which are trained in clinical trials with many prior protocols based
Yeah.
on how they are written and all the sections that may be involved. And using such a customized, custom developed large language model for this purpose would certainly help reduce time frames. Even one day can mean several hundreds of millions of dollars for a phase 3 clinical trial if we can minimize that delay in
Yeah.
terms of, because these drugs are have a very limited patent life, and the revenue and the return on investment needs to occur in a short period of time, that is, after the marketing approval is received. And
So
so
do these specialized large language models already exist, and are they being used?
they are being created at a very rapid pace within the last couple years,
Yeah.
after the massive success of ChatGPT. But there is also Gemini and many other Claude and other models, and on top of which different life science domain specific models are also being created, either for internal consumption within organizations and companies, or for broader consumption on a vertical specialization basis. So yes, absolutely.
So are such tools commercially available already, or is that under development?
I would say under development and in pilot phases, not
Mhm.
like fully developed and commercially available yet.
I see. Fascinating. All right. So going back a couple of steps to the racial representation, and of course, it's not just about race. It's about, as you said, it's about sex and socioeconomic status and all sorts of things potentially.
Yeah,
How is AI being used to? This is really a question of recruitment, right? Because it's recruitment, of course, which determines the sample of the composition of a
yeah,
clinical
that's
trial
the gorilla
samples.
in the room. Yeah.
Right. So how is AI being used to recruit samples, clinical trial samples, to address these kinds of problems?
Yeah, I think there are companies that are specializing in matching patients to clinical trials at a
Mhm.
large scale. For example, utilizing big data licensed for from prescription drug databases, claims databases, electronic medical records at different hospital systems, to analyze data to identify most eligible patients that match the inclusion exclusion criteria of a given clinical trial protocol. Uh, that's one area where several companies have been making good progress. I think that's starting to show some signs of value
Mm.
recovery.
Yeah.
But these these are only as good as the input data quality, and so 90% of the AI in that space is actually data quality curation, aggregation, and processing, and only 10% is the final aspect of actually applying that matching algorithms.
Yeah.
So it's if you don't start with a more broader inclusive database, then starting with a biased data set can actually lead to significant uh, challenges downstream.
Yes.
And so that's still a very early days and limiting factor, I would say. But it's very promising that especially in the United States, where most medical records are already electronic, uh, and which may not be true in many other countries still, unfortunately. And the data might be still on paper or distributed and siloed. Like individual patients may have that data in PDF format or images and different formats,
Mm.
but it may not all be aggregated at the hospital system level or on a national scale. In countries like India, for example, that those do not still exist in fully digital formats, although they may exist in bits and pieces here and there.
Okay. Now, one thing that people who are involved in clinical trials tend to love and adore is data analysis. Very exciting. I'm not. It sounds sarcastic to say, but it really isn't. Data analysis is a very interesting, very exciting part of the clinical trial process because, of course, that's where the entire meaning of the exercise comes from, right? So how is AI being used either now or potentially in guiding or performing data analysis?
Yeah, so clinical trials rely on highly accurate capture of data in standardized data formats and controlled vocabularies like MEDRA or who drug database and so on. But also there is opportunity to automate some of the data management, anomaly detection in clinical trials, especially during the clinical trial process itself, rather than as an afterthought when it's too late to go back and make any changes.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's critical that the clinical trial process enable highly validated, reliable, accurate data capture systems in the first place, and to have the ability to continuously monitor the data for automatic anomaly detection. That's an area where we at Jeeva, but also more broadly on an industry scale, are focused on um, automating and making driving significant efficiency. And three, at the as the clinical trial is progressing, we want to keep constantly looking for signals as sponsors to do some interim analysis with limited data as it keeps coming in, as they
Yeah.
trickle in at different sites, to get some early signals of any safety
Mm-hmm.
concerns from a medical monitoring point of view, or for efficacy signals and any adverse reactions, to keep monitoring that. And some significant part of this is automation, I would say, rather than artificial intelligence. But there might be um, use of unstructured data and automatic natural language processing and generative AI, where text and multimedia content may need to be processed for various uh, use cases and monitoring purposes for automation, which does involve some level of AI, as well as more and more data types like audio, video, multimedia content, like Amazon Prime, enabling patients to watch educational videos in their native language might
Yeah.
be necessary to address the FDA's diversity and inclusion plans, where 40% of US population, for example, is Spanish speaking now, and many of them may also be fluent in English, but their native language may not be. And that's just one example, but there's many languages across the globe that, if we want to be more inclusive, enable them to watch any video in any language, or their native language, with the subtitles in their preferred language. Now, this is easier done for movies and flicks, but in the case of regulated industry like clinical trials, these may need to be tamed and cautioned with verified, certified translations for accuracy, as miscommunication and misinformation can be potentially dangerous in clinical trials. And so it adds a additional layer of human verification and validation of these translations.
Now, when it comes to clinical trial data analysis, it's it's an art which has all sorts of nuances, and it's a very subtle thing. Now, it's easy enough, I think, to understand all these kind of benefits. I'm just wondering, how do you deal with the possibility that an AI system could introduce errors and identify anomalies that aren't really anomalies at all? This could have quite a big impact on your results and your conclusions. And wherever, if that happened, for example, where would the liability lie, and how would those discussions go with the regulators? All rather complex. So the basic question is, what do you do when things go wrong with data analysis? How do you handle that if you're primarily reliant on AI systems?
Yeah, no, I think this is definitely an area where AI is being implemented with a ton of caution for good reasons. Life science industry in general is not the first vertical to adopt newer technologies before it proves out its reliability, safety of use in various different verticals, which may be less regulated or less life or death type industries. And so, as they say, pornography is the first to adopt new technologies, and life sciences is the last, healthcare and sciences.
I didn't know
So,
that. Perhaps I'm
yeah.
doing the wrong podcast.
But the point here is that the AI, while with all its potential benefits, which may seem obvious from the surface, as we start peeling the layers of the onion, like you rightly pointed out, there is potential for identifying anomalies that may not actually be anomalies, and in some cases, missing the real anomalies. And so the automated AI and bots and all that needs to be supplemented, complemented, verified, and validated by humans and experts, which remain indispensable in this clinical trial and regulated space. And I think there are areas where data analysis, like the routine biostatistical analysis comparing placebo versus treatment arms or different dosing arms, and PK/PD type uh, analysis, those are pretty standardized statistical methods. But
Yeah.
specific to a given clinical trial, knowing what specific adverse events are anticipated or unexpected adverse events that may occur, or other signals that are specific to that particular clinical trial, those I think only the humans involved are requiring to be analyzing and monitoring on a continuous basis, where AI may have immediate, um, maybe at best act as assistants to these experts, but not replace them anytime soon.
Yeah. Now, AI systems have been around for a long time in early stage drug development, right? With identifying possible candidate molecules for drugs
Yeah.
based on molecular structure and so forth.
Yes.
How now? When I say a long time, I think I probably mean around 15 years or something,
Hmm.
right? Is that am I right?
Yeah.
Now, how would you could you describe how the field is changing over time and where the current status is within that unfolding process of change?
Yeah, I think clinical trials is essentially needs to catch up with the AI's revolution that's unfolding in the discovery space, where that's producing a large number of highly confident drug candidates at a unprecedented speed and numbers. But the clinical trial process is nowhere as efficient yet to take all of those in a cost effective way
Yeah,
through the clinical trial process. Certainly in silico clinical trials are what FDA terms as virtual clinical trials,
yeah,
which are essentially computational models and testing a candidate drug entirely in silico for safety and efficacy in synthetic arms and so on. But also in a human clinical trial, there might be opportunities to supplement the human arms with synthetic arms, where some arms may be in silico and others might be actual in vivo and human. And so that's one area that's be coming up quite exciting phase, I would say, where it may not be able to in silico trials may not be able to replace human trials in many areas, but in some areas there are opportunities to, as they say, for very severe infectious diseases, for example, like Ebola, which in the context of a pandemic can be life or death and require significant safety masks and all that, with where the FDA has, for example, animal rule, where they don't have to test all the patients in humans, but they could demonstrate that same effect in animals instead of humans,
yeah.
because it's just practically not possible to have enough patients with a particular severe disease like Ebola.
Well, I think in silico clinical trials are, I mean, it's a fascinating area. I would
Yeah.
assume that we need clinical trials to compare, to make a head-to-head comparison between in silico clinical trials and real human clinical trials. It's a funny sort of iteration there. So I wonder, however, what in general is the mood like amongst regulators and companies? How accepting or how suspicious are they of these various different applications of AI?
I personally feel like there is a lot of talk and little adoption and action in
Hmm.
most critical parts of clinical trials. But where the risk is minimal, where human subjects are not involved, like protocol design, for example, where we are not really touching human subjects yet, or downstream for automatically generating reports, case report forms, or publications. I think those are all safe and cool parts of the clinical trial process where AI is generously being piloted, or even put to good adoption. The core part of clinical trials, where patient recruitment part, where screening and coming up with patients to screen and take them into the recruitment funnel, I think there is significant low risk and big impact.
Yeah,
And patient recruitment continues to be a huge problem in clinical trials. That's puts brakes on the speed. And many times, 30% of these clinical trials terminate because they can't fully enroll, or even start to enroll a good number of patients in a reasonable amount of time,
yeah.
leading to their termination. So I think addressing the patient recruitment is an area. So I think there are very specific focused areas where AI is making a impact, but not just quite in replacing humans. As I say, AI will not replace clinical trials, but clinical trials that use AI will replace clinical trials that do not use AI eventually.
Yes. Well, look, Harsha, we could talk about this all day long. I mean, we haven't, for example, talked about using AI to develop precision medicines, which is something I've worked on myself. From the very beginning of drug development to the very end, there are all sorts of potential applications of AI. So it's a really interesting area, very very important. So,
Absolutely. One of
fact.
the
Mhm.
yeah, one of the aspects of the application of AI in clinical trial management is that the entire clinical trial infrastructure is built on integrating multiple point solutions. A tool used for patient screening is very different from tools used for electronic data capture
Yeah,
from a different vendor, and protocol design is done using a different set of tools, etc. Lab reports are coming from a different source, and so on. So that it's a typically in a phase 3 clinical trial could involve at least 30 different point solutions, where users have to log in between sponsors, CROs, and sites, and which practically makes it impossible to automate the workflow from a process point of view. Whereas there may be opportunity to automate and apply AI in each bucket, like I
yeah,
pointed out, patient recruitment bucket. But how does that flow the efficiency across this workflow from recruitment through data, the last patient, last visit, and database lock and data analysis,
mhm,
and that's that's where I see the opportunity for unified software platforms that combine all these siloed fragmented tools into one purpose built platform. Now you have control over the nuts and bolts of the entire platform and the process, which
yeah.
allows an opportunity to automate the workflow rather than individual silos.
Absolutely right. Well, look, very very best of luck with Jeeva Clinical Trials. Um, Harsha, I wonder, as the last question, whether I could ask you what your favorite current example of medical AI is that's got nothing to do with Jiva clinical trials.
As absolutely, I think from what I am most intrigued and excited about always is the holy grail, as I call, is the robotic surgeries. Where precision robotics, open heart surgeries, life or death surgeries, where there is very few limited number of surgeons that can actually do precise surgeries with great outcomes, with success rates. Typically, they say 98% success rate and 2% risk. And if there are robots, which there are already for many types of surgeries, that can be performed either by a human doctor using robots, or the robot entirely performing the surgery without a human surgeon, maybe just monitoring or observing as well. I think those that type of robotic AI based surgeries, I think, are fascinating and just over and above any of us could imagine, uh, literally cutting open a human body and fixing in the body.
It's also the basis for a really good science fiction horror film, right?
It's actually happening right now with Intuitive Surgical and companies like that. And I personally visited Mount Sinai and met with a uh, marathon running sub-Saharan Africa. He traveled on a motorbike, and he's a cardiac surgeon at Mount Sinai, and he's actually building this robot for open heart surgeries, because he doesn't see that it's scalable otherwise. The number of people who require these bypass and open heart surgeries, and the number of surgeons who are able and willing to do that with consistent success rates is just not scalable in this growing population. So I think I'm confident and hopeful that those robotic surgeries can be saving the light at the end of the tunnel.
Quite right. Look, Harsha, thank you so much for joining. It's been a great discussion. I've learned lots, I think. And yeah, I wish you all the best.
Thanks for having me, Felix. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. Ping me on LinkedIn if you have any ideas on new subjects or guests.